Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we're going to take a look at Rappan Athuk. This is a gigantic mega dungeon created for Swords and Wizardry, which is a retro clone of original Dungeons and Dragons, and put out by Necromancer Games and Fransgaard Games. It's been out for a long time. It came out in its original form in the early 2000s, I think, but it's been revised and expanded many times since then. I believe it comes in rules for a couple different editions. Like you can get a 5th edition version of this, I think at least, or maybe there's a Pathfinder version. I forget exactly. I'll put links in the description below. This thing is famously gigantic. There's about a solid 400 pages of dungeon rooms and descriptions in here. And going through the whole thing would take forever. So what I'm going to do is focus mostly on one particular level. And that is a level that I actually was a player in and I helped clear out. So I got a very good sense of what a typical level of Rappan Athuk looks like. Before we get started though, quick shout out to today's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Into the AM and their series of fantasy and sci-fi themed t-shirts. Right now they have a new series that's just come out that has a lot of these minimalist designs that I really quite like. This one in particular is really great at evoking a black hole. It might work really well if you're running any kind of sci-fi horror or mothership campaign. All their shirts are really comfortable and really affordable too. They frequently have great deals over at their web store. If you use my link in the description below, you can get an additional 10% off the whole web store. Thanks again to Into the AM for sponsoring. Now let's get back to the show. All right, let's look inside and see what we get here. We have our authors here, lots of different authors, including people like Bill Webb and Gabor Lux. I've done reviews of some of his work in the past, like Castles in Tillin. Matt Finch, creator of Swords and Wizardry. Skeeter Green, a bunch of the Frog God people. And lots of levels here. There are 15 main levels, but a lot of sub-levels. It's hard to really describe the scale of this thing, so let's get over to the side view map. So this is the ground level right here. And there's lots of different ways you can get into this mega dungeon, right? Each of these is a possible entrance. There's a main area where you're supposed to go in to get into level 1, but there's lots of shrines and locations and villages scattered around the area that can also connect to the dungeon in one way or another. We have our main levels going down right here. It goes over onto this page over here, all the way down to level 15. But there's lots of these sub-levels off on the side that are kind of connected to each other and eventually often connect back up with the main levels. Although the way that they do so is pretty convoluted. It begins with a wilderness area mapped right here. All of these different locations have a more detailed write-up later on. And as I said, a lot of these locations do connect to the mega dungeon in one way or another. They all have their own random encounter tables. The different locations like the forests, the swamps, the foothills are all detailed. Different types of bandit groups that you can encounter. And we get into monster layers and some of the more particular places like the different areas, the Black Fane, the Troll Mound, the lair of Darog's ruffians, a lot of small little dungeon areas that you can explore here, I guess as kind of like appetizers to get you in the mood for dungeoneering before you hit the main course of Rappan Athuk itself. There are a couple little problems with the binding, like these pages are actually stuck together. Not totally sure what the deal is. I don't see that very often happening in here. Overall, the thing feels very hefty and very well designed. Paper quality is not great. You can kind of see through it if you hold it up to the light, but it's not really that big of a deal. The text is pretty dense throughout. So this is designed in a different time than what we would call the modern old school Renaissance, where attention to layout is much more of a big thing now. So back then, things are just in these big chunks of text, in these big fat paragraphs. Usually the text does not go on for too long. Most of the rooms only have, 1 or 2 paragraphs, but it doesn't make it very easy to run on the fly because you do have to read the whole paragraph and kind of pull it apart in your head to figure out what you're going to need to tell players first, what to tell them second, and things like that. This is the ground level, so the graveyard and the mausoleum. This is the main entrance to Rappan Athuk itself. We have the well that you're not supposed to go down. There's rumors everywhere of people telling you don't go down the well because that's one of the main entrances. And there's another one over here. One fun touch is that the area surrounding this mausoleum is a graveyard. And if you get up close and examine the stones, you actually see the names of the different people with little epitaphs on them. And I believe that most of these people are people who died in Rappan Athuk, like actual PC characters that have died during playtesting, which I think is really funny. To give you a quick sense of the kind of diversity in the types of dungeon levels that we might see in here, let's look at the table of contents real quick. Your main levels are the lair of the Dung Monster, Marthek's Place and Ambrose Base. We have Beware the Purple Worms, the Upper Temple of Orcus. This is an Orcus-themed dungeon. You go all the way to the very bottom, down to level 15. You can fight Orcus himself. Banth's Lair and the White Catacombs, the Maze. Gotta have a maze if you have a mega dungeon. The Gates of Hell, only on level 7. The Tomb of the, let's see, where's level 8? Caves and Caverns, the Tomb of the Evil King. The Lower Temple of Orcus is 9. The Lava Pit, the Waterfall and Akbeth's Grave. The Slave Pits, the Portal of Darkness, the Chapel of Orcus, and the Den of the Master. Our review today is going to focus on looking at the Mouth of Doom, level 1C, which is the one that I played. By looking through this particular level, I think we're going to see one of the main strengths of Rappan Athuk. This mega dungeon is so gigantic that it's going to be the very rare group that is going to play all of the levels. I'm sure someone has done it. I doubt that it's very common though. However, each of these levels are pretty self-contained. And I think that what they're really great for is you can just yank them out and drop them into your own campaign world as its own little dungeon to explore. There's a good amount of variety in there. There's a lot of good jiquang where you can move around in circles and loops and attack things from different angles. And it's a great introduction to a very classic style of old school dungeon where it's much less about thematic unity, because a lot of these dungeon levels don't really have that. It's much more about the terror of exploring these darkened tunnels room by room, opening that door, seeing what's in there, and then having to deal with it. It's much drier and more sparse, I think are the words that I would use, than what you see in the OSR today. But that has its own virtues. It definitely has more breathing room than what you would typically see in a modern dungeon. There's a reasonable number of empty rooms here, rooms that have nothing of consequence in them. These sorts of rooms are there, I think, to add a sense of pacing to the adventure. They build tension. As you walk through a room, there may be something in there, there may not be, and then that builds the tension for what's going to be in the next room and then in the next one. They also provide a kind of a theater where different events can take place, because you still have random encounters that could appear in these rooms, still have battles that could move through these places, and so it creates a more open space. Whereas if you have very dense, very thematically unified dungeons or adventures, every single place is kind of packed with meaning, and so it's harder to have these sort of like sprawling fights, these battles, and this sense of slowly moving towards something exciting when everything is exciting in every room. It's really just a different style. Our random encounters are pretty basic here. We just got some skeletons, some kobolds, some zombies, and some giant rats, and possibly some bandits and giant ants. These are rolled on a 1 through 5 on a d20, and you roll every 30 minutes. At first I thought that was a little strange, because in traditional D&D you typically roll every 20 minutes and you have a 1 in 6 chance of an encounter. Whereas this is a 1 in 4 chance of encounter basically every half hour. I think that though statistically works out to being about the same. It's just another way of doing it. This level starts out right here in the Chamber of Doors. As you descend these steps, you right away see 6 different doors surrounding you. You have a lot of choices here in terms of what direction you want to go. Some of these doors are fake. They actually don't go anywhere, and there's a trap beneath it. Some of them have these bars that you can try and find a way to lower, perhaps. This one has a trap door, but if you go down to the bottom of it, there is a secret passage leading you all the way to over here, which gives you access to a part of the dungeon that's actually pretty hard to get to. So there's a lot of variety in terms of the different directions that you can go. There's a lot of jiquang, as I mentioned before. There's a lot of non-linearity in the way that it's designed. It's not linear, and it's not branching either. It's more like a network, which means that you can genuinely explore this dungeon. The direction that you go in is going to make a difference in terms of what your experiences are. And the way that you map and the way that you navigate it is going to be much more up to you instead of being guided by the design of the game. Some of the room descriptions are frankly a bit longer than I would like, but honestly, they're not that bad. The entire level is about 6 pages long or so. So while this might be a bit difficult to read and run on the fly, reading 6 pages of this is not really that big of a deal. Before the dungeon adventure starts, read through the whole level and maybe perhaps make notes on it, and you'll have a pretty good sense of what's in every room. And I think you'll be able to run them with not too many problems. We have some empty rooms, including this one that's just old cobwebs. This room that just says, "This room is featureless and empty," yielding no clues about its original purpose. That's a little disappointing. You could easily put a little bit of flavor in there to give a sense of what it was before. But then we have some rooms like an infested mosaic that has giant centipedes that slowly crawl out of it, a tapestry room, a suffocating room where you find skeletons lying on the floor of people who have just lied down and died, because it has a very slow draft of poisonous air and sleeping in there can be quite deadly. We have some rooms where clever play is definitely possible, like this one beneath the slime pocket. The entire ceiling of this room is coated in green slime. That's because there's a giant underground reservoir of green slime that is pressing down on the ceiling of this room, cracking the ceiling and slowly dripping down. So if you walk into the room, you can have green slime dripping down on top of you, which is very much a bad time. However, if you find a way to collapse the room, collapse the ceiling, or if a bomb goes off in the next room, then the whole thing splashes down and would kill anything in there. That'd be very deadly for you, but of course, this could also be set up as a trap that you could use to kill other enemy monsters with. Some of the rooms aren't so much mechanically interesting as just visually interesting and give a sense of awe and wonder as you're exploring this, dark labyrinth underground. So for example, this one is a large room containing 3 rows of pillars running north to south, leading to 2 deep bronze fire pits that stand against the south wall. Each fire pit contains a wide bronze bowl 10 feet across, and these are both blazing with eerie green flames that rise 10 feet into the air, throwing emerald sparks towards the chamber's arching 30-foot high ceiling. Great stuff like that. Love it. We have 2 different bandit hideouts. These are actually separated by some distance within the dungeon, and they're trying to find each other again. This allows for definitely some negotiation. Perhaps you can ally yourself with these bandits to help survive, help them find each other again. Or if you get into a fight with one of them, the other group may hear the commotion and come running and you're attacked on 2 sides. I would definitely run the bandits as a kind of dungeon faction, probably rolling reaction dice for them just to see how they react to the party, so that you never know if they're going to be friendly or hostile. Having people to talk to and interact with in the dungeon is a big deal, so you're not just crawling around and fighting things. We also have a chamber of magic pools right here, which is really great because it gives players a lot of things to interact with. It doesn't make a lot of sense, right? It's a kind of a gonzo concept, as we'll see. There's a number of rooms like that in here. But they give players tools. By looking at this water and seeing what it does and manipulating it and perhaps taking it with them, they give players new ways to interact with the environment. For example, you have a pool of detection to help you detect magic items. You have a pool of prodigious fortune to gain +2 on all saves, and a pool of poison. Yes, the entire pool is deadly poison you have to save or die. Hopefully no players die in the course of that, but even if one does, then getting a giant bucket of that water and carrying it around with you is probably going to be really useful. Just throwing it at a monster's face could kill them right away. There's also a pool of descent where if you climb down, you realize that the water is in fact not there, and you can head down to a secret passage and go somewhere else. This room right here is really fun, the Altar of the Gods of Chance. My group had a lot of fun tinkering with this. Essentially, it's a slot machine. You go into this big room, and there are 3 panels on the wall. And when you touch it, it lights up with one of 6 possible symbols. And if 3 players or 3 PCs touch all 3 of these panels, you get 3 random symbols out of a possible 6, and that tells you what happens. Unfortunately, the way this is set up is that most results don't do anything. These are the only ways that these particular combinations are the only ones that give you an unusual result. But because you're rolling 3d6, there is a lot of possible permutations. I think there's 216 different ways you can roll 3d6. And these are the only ones that actually give you a result. So if I was running this, I would expand this so that there was more ways that you could get these results so that more things would happen. Otherwise, a lot of groups are just going to be touching these panels and nothing's going to happen and they're just going to leave. And that's no fun. Some of this stuff includes like doubling the amount of money that you put inside a bowl, or if you roll really badly, you get a demon that summons and attacks you. I remember when I was playing this, I was a halfling, and we figured out that if you put gold into this bowl, you had a chance of doubling it. So I was small enough that I climbed into the bowl to see if I could double myself. I don't think it ever worked. I don't think we rolled the right number, but fun stuff like that could come up. We have Gulliver the Lunatic, an NPC that you can pick up and he'll wander around with you. He has in fact eaten all of his friends after he was lost down here in the dungeon, and maybe he'll eat you too. He's not terribly useful. Whenever you get into combat, he just starts screaming like a maniac and causing more encounter rolls. So you might want to get rid of him pretty quickly. Here's a fun little trap. Woe betide the barefoot halfling. There was a pair of boots and a metal gauntlet lying in front of the door to this room. Note that the party is almost certain to encounter the room's trap before entering. The floor directly in front of the door and the handle, and the floor and walls of the room itself are all coated with an extremely adhesive alchemical glue. So what you see is the boots stuck to the floor in front of the room because someone's boots were stuck there and they had to pull their feet out, right? And a metal gauntlet lying in front of the door because it was stuck to the door. The only downside to the way this was written is that the glue wears off automatically pretty quickly, and therefore these items, which are now there, are no longer stuck to the door or to the floor. What I would do is I would have the adhesive still be working and make it very obvious that the door and the inside of the room is super, super sticky. So that gives the players the space to figure out what to do. Once you make it obvious what the problem is, the players can set to work with solving it. And I think that's a lot more fun. If they just get stuck to the floor and they don't really have a way out, that's less fun. There is a way that you can get off the glue, mostly by washing it with lantern oil, but that's not something that everyone's going to think about. So I want to focus on the problem itself. There's a room with a gelatinous cube that can slowly chase you down a corridor and threaten to squish you against a wall. You have a room of grim fossils. I love stuff like this, where there's some sort of obvious magical catastrophe that happened in the past, where the walls of the room are made of mortared stones, but fossilized human skeletons poke out from it to varying degrees, right? That's nice and scary. You don't have to explain why it's happened. Wizards have been down here. Anything could have happened. I just love having these strange sights pop up that players can wonder about. And if you want to get out of the level itself, you have to get past the cobra stairs, where an iron cobra will come to life and fight you to prevent you from going down to the next level. And that passageway down to the next level, those stairs can transform into a slide to slide you down, which is a classic type of trap. So this is what a level of Rappan Athuk tends to be like. A decent amount of empty space in there, pockmarked with some strange rooms, some weird traps, some locations with just interesting effects that you can manipulate if you can figure out what they do. And then within that, you have random encounters popping up that you have to deal with. Some possibly friendly, some neutral, some dangerous. This continues on throughout the next, as I said, 15 levels plus tons of side levels. Each of them, about the same size. That's about the same size as the one we were just in. This one is the Demon's Gullet. The writing is to the point. It's not florid. It could be condensed a little bit more, but it's not confusing in any of the cases that I read. Look, it's a mazes. I don't know if I would actually put players through a maze. I don't think anyone would have that much fun with that. Maybe I would abstract it in some way. The illustrations are a mixed bag. They definitely have that early 2000s old school look. A lot of early OSR stuff had art like this, where I feel like it was really trying to emulate the art style from early D&D, where it's mostly black and white. And it has a very enthusiastic and kind of amateurish look to it, which some people really enjoy. Because by being a bit less polished, it feels more accessible. It feels more like the kind of thing that a player would draw, which has its own charm to it. Once we get near the end, it's a fun illustration. Once we get near the end, we see some extra stuff, including some actual play mats. Here we go. Some playmats that you can print out. I wouldn't use these ones in the book because of the curve of the book, but they're actual 1-inch squares. So some particularly important battle areas, you can print out these pages from the PDF, and then you actually have a battle mat that you can use, which is actually very clever. And not a lot of books do that. I really appreciate that. It comes with a bunch of pre-generated characters that you can use, possibly as PCs. They are all level 1, so yeah, you can use them as PCs. Or as rival adventuring parties, because those are always fun to have running around inside the dungeon. You also have a section on the different types of gods of the area that may have a presence or adherence if you're talking to NPCs in the dungeon. And we have a short little bestiary of the types of monsters that you might find in here. Most of these look like fairly standard D&D monsters, but you might have a couple that are unique to Rappan Athuk. Most of the time, the monsters have very short, concise stat blocks that fit right into the room descriptions, which is really great. But some of them that are more elaborate can have longer descriptions here. And that's the basic overview. Oh, there you are, fighting Orcus, the big bad guy at the end. Spoilers. So there's our overview of Rappan Athuk. This thing is a monster. Probably not a lot of groups are going to try and run the whole thing, but especially if you go through and you look for those rooms that have interesting tricks and traps, there is a lot that you can loot from this to stick in your own dungeons, as long as you don't mind something fairly gonzo. or rip entire levels out and just have that as a standalone dungeon for players to explore if they want something a little bit more classic and a little bit more grindy in a good way, in terms of like moving slowly and carefully, investigating, checking for traps, opening those doors, getting ready to ambush the skeletons inside. If you're into that style of play, Rappan Athuk is the mega dungeon for that. It has those levels going down in contrast to something like Barrow Maze, which is another big mega dungeon that people talk about, which is one big floor. By having these vertical dungeons going down, like a lot of the very early dungeons in D&D, it allows players to control a bit more the level of difficulty because things get more deadly as you go down. So you can kind of pick the level of risk and reward that you're comfortable with. Anyway, I'll put links in the description below for where you can find the physical and PDF versions of Rappan Athuk. And thanks for watching. See you guys next time.